We are now conveniently excited to introduce the panel, The Legacy of Global Non-Alignment, How Small Countries and Middle Powers Navigate in a Multipolar World. Our esteemed panelists are Branka Latinović, Vice Chair of the Forum for International Relations, European Movement in Serbia, Thomas Greminger, Director of the Geneva Center for Security Policy, and Thomas Mayr-Harting, former EEAS Managing Director and former Ambassador of the EU and Austria to the UN in New York. The panel discussion will be moderated by Aleksandra Godfroid, producer and reporter for N1 Television. Please join me on the stage.
Oops. Okay. Well, thank you all for being here. Thank you all for agreeing to participate in this panel, and thanks to Professor Tvrtko Jakovina for his lecture about a man that was born when the geopolitical ground was shifting, then lived through one world order, saw the unipolar world that was created, and died when again we are in the times when the geopolitical ground is shifting under us, creating something possibly new. Now, in those times gone by, we had the non-alignment movement. Do you think, and this is a question for each one of you, that neutrality is possible in this geopolitical reality? And if yes, then under what and which conditions? Shall we start with you, please?
Sure, with pleasure. Well, I would argue that today's topic is as relevant now as it was during the Cold War. I think this renewed interest in non-alignment, or perhaps I should say multi-alignment and neutrality as a foreign policy choice for small states and middle powers, I think it speaks to the shifts taking place in our international system. It's a reflection of a transformation to a multipolar, multicentric world order. It's a reflection of more and more states wishing not to be caught in between a poorly managed geopolitical competition between the United States, China, and Russia. States not wanting to be obliged to choose a camp. And I think in that sense, it's a very relevant debate. Again, I mean, I'm happy as a representative of a small state myself to share with you a few insights on how a small state can position itself in this new multipolar world. I'm not pretending that neutrality is the only way. As a matter of fact, a small state has basically three different choices. It's bandwagoning, it's hedging, or it's neutrality. Bandwagoning basically implies that you join for good an alliance, like NATO, for instance. Hedging means that you choose your partners selectively in function of a specific topic. And the third alternative is neutrality on a more permanent basis. Now, what does neutrality imply? And I think you have to differentiate fundamentally between legal obligations, the law of neutrality, and neutrality policy. Now, when it comes to the legal obligations, there are very few, very important ones. It's basically about not militarily supporting a party in conflict, and it's about not joining a military alliance. Beyond that, when it comes to neutrality policy, you're extremely flexible. I mean, give you two examples. Switzerland decided to join the economic sanctions after Russia invaded Ukraine. That is very much part of our understanding of neutrality policy. To give you another example, last week the Swiss Air Force trained with the US Air Force Europe together in Switzerland in order to be better trained, better interoperable, better prepared. So this shows, I think, two things. First of all, neutrality is not a foreign policy objective for us. It's clearly a foreign policy tool. And I think the second point that I would want to make here, neutrality does not mean being neutral in terms of values, in terms of responding to breaches of international law or breaches of international humanitarian law. I think on the contrary, I think small states are have a very strong interest in the rule of law, in a system, in an international system that is predictable, you know, where basically, you know, you have international law, you have rules as guiding principles, as a compass, also, you know, in a new multipolar, multicentric world. So neutrality does not mean being neutral in values. Let me perhaps conclude with, you know, three principles that I would advise a neutral to follow if he wants to be a successful neutral state. And it's pursuing an active foreign policy. It is diversifying your partnerships, and it's being predictable. Let me briefly elaborate with one or two sentences each principle. I think as a neutral, you need to be perceived as useful to the international community. This implies pursuing an active foreign policy. In the case of Switzerland, it has been a consistently strong engagement in promoting peace and security, engaging in conflict resolution, in conflict management, but also investing a lot in development cooperation. So, yeah, being perceived to be useful. The second principle, diversify your relations politically, economically, diplomatically, and I also insist on the notion of partnership. You know, and would I be talking to a Swiss audience? I'm aware I'm not talking to a Swiss audience. I would be insisting of, you know, formalizing also your relationship with the European Union in a sustainable way. And thirdly, you need to be predictable. Neutrality is not something that you can pursue for 6 months, then change, and again come back. You need to be perceived as reliably neutral by others. And this also comes along with a capacity to defend itself. And I think that is a very important notion, in particular when we perhaps later on in our discussion come to talk about the in-between states in Europe.
Yeah. How you defined it, neutrality, seems like a very complicated stuff to do. Ms. Latinović, what would you say? Is it possible? Is it possible for us to be neutral, Serbia?
It's a possible or not possible. I think it's one side of the story, but another side of the story is it's necessary to exist as one way in international relations. We have to make some differences between neutrality and non-aligned movement of non-aligned policy, because neutrality is much older. And it's also have a strong legal prerequisite, and we have in mind that the neutrality was defined under the Hague Convention since 1997. the non-alignment came as a result of the Cold War, after the Second World War, and the strong bloc divisions. And non-alignment was one original response of the states of the so-called Third World on the bloc divisions and the atmosphere of confrontations which exist in that time in the world, but particularly in Europe, because the two blocs met in Europe, NATO and Warsaw Pact. Non-aligned movement also has one common basis, common approach, but because it was the group of the states which, as one prerequisite, has resistance. Resistance to the colonial status under which the majority of the states were in the time when the non-aligned movement was formed, and also fight against the colonialism was one of the main pillar of the movement in that sense. But at the same time, it was constructed on the basis of the Charter of United Nations, but also principles of the Bandung Conference, 55 Brioni Conference, and particularly first Belgrade Conference on the criteria which were that no one of the non-aligned states will be member of one of the blocs. They would not sign the military agreement with the superpower, and do not allow the foreign troops on their territories. It means that this security dimension was very, very, very active and was dominant something within the policy. But it was successful because it was also the interest of the superpower that this bloc of countries, Third World, were together, not to incline to one of another blocs. In spite of this mutual understanding among the big powers, Soviet Union was more aggressive regarding to the non-aligned states through Cuba, and tried to define one club of the natural alliance, with the aim to explain that this group of countries are more close to the socialist countries than to the West. But also the West, it means USA and Europe, had ambition to put domination under the movement and to have them in the General Assembly as a voting machinery, which is very important. This put into question the unity in one period of time, unity of the movement, and it was culmination during the summit in Havana, 79, and this division was avoided thanks to the Tito. And he succeeded again that non-aligned movement reform principles of not to cling to one of the blocs and to continue as an independent international subject. But now, in these circumstances, which we have completely another landscape in Europe and in the world also, the status to be neutral on a non-aligned have now the same relevance as it was during the Cold War. And more successful period of the non-aligned were during the Cold War. After the ending of this, the relevances and significance of the non-aligned as political movement, it's without infrastructure, institutionalization, and etc., start to be losing. And we have in mind that the success of the non-aligned in that period was thanks to the personality, strong leadership, particularly of Tito, and Yugoslavia as a motor of the non-aligned. When the dissolution of Yugoslavia, the ending of the blocs in the Europe, non-aligned movement have not found some particular special items from the interest. I think that we have now faced with something new. It's a BRICS, which remind me on some type of the non-alignment. We have in mind that instead of the third world, now is using the terms the global south countries, that majority of these are from this region in any way, but in the future, this definition of the foreign policy is not be successful and not be one option for the Europe, particularly, including for Serbia.
Yes. What is neutrality now?
Well, let me also, because we've had this very impressive historical background of non-alignment, Foreign Minister Budimir Lonča. I, in fact, worked for Austrian Foreign Minister Alois Mock when he worked with Minister Lonča. Let me also give a little bit of history to the Austrian case. I mean, Austria, as is well known, opted for neutrality in 1955 as a political price to end quadripartite occupation of the country, and in particular Soviet occupation in the east of the country. In the so-called Moscow Memorandum, which was not a contractual obligation but a political concession, Austria said, the Austrian government at the time said, that we would follow a neutrality according to the model of Switzerland. And it's, by the way, interesting in the context of today's discussion why we said according to the model of Switzerland, because the Austrian government at the time wanted to make absolutely clear that this was not about ideological neutrality, that we did not want to join the movement of non-aligned countries, but that we wanted to continue as a Western-style democracy, and therefore the Swiss neutrality model. And this was then enshrined in a constitutional law in 1955, and on that basis we continued to operate. And what was a sort of political concession in 1955 became a policy that reached a very high level of popularity, in particular during the East-West conflict, when we did see a possibility for cooperation with the neutral and non-aligned countries, and it also helped to make Vienna a seat of international organizations, in particular of the United Nations, after New York, and Geneva of the OSCE and others. And it still remains very much supported by the Austrian public. But we sort of differed from Switzerland from the very beginning, because first of all, we joined the United Nations in 1955, a few months after we'd said that we'd follow the model of Switzerland, which had decided for reasons of neutrality to stay outside of the United Nations until the 1990s. And the biggest difference, of course, is that from 1995 onwards, Austria decided to join the European Union. And I understand that we'll speak later on more precisely about the importance of neutrality in Europe. But joining the European Union had a very fundamental impact on our policy and even on our legal status. Because when we joined the European Union, we promised to participate fully and in a spirit of solidarity in common foreign and security policy of the European Union. The European Union accepted that we remain neutral in legal terms, but in fact, in the understanding that we have since then, this is a purely military neutrality. It was never seen as a political neutrality, and it was never seen as ideological neutrality. And we could sort of do, and we still can do, a certain number of things, especially in areas where there's no agreed position of the European Union. We can, of course, play an active role in the field of disarmament, and I think you've worked together with Austrians in this area. We have neutrality has helped us to maintain Vienna, as I already said, as a seat of international organizations, and there have been conflicts where the European Union as a group has not engaged that much, where Austria has played useful international services, like, for instance, East Timor and some other examples. And we also remain a venue of for international encounters. But of course, now that, as the European Union itself says, when war has returned to Europe, and in a manner that deeply implicates the European Union as a whole, neutrality as a political concept in this specific context cannot play a role. Of course, Austria, in the conflict between an aggressor and the aggressed party, between Russia and Ukraine, cannot be neutral between these two parties, more specifically because the European Union as a whole, in reality, has taken sides in this conflict. And this, of course, means that we follow more or less fully what the European Union is doing in this field. And in fact, it is also worth noting that when we joined the European Union, we in fact created a legal framework which allows us, where necessary, to give priority to obligations of European foreign and security policy over classical neutrality concepts. And I mean, you said in the case of Switzerland that the Swiss neutrality does not allow one party, you to support one party militarily or with any kind of military support in a conflict. Of course, Austria, for political reasons, has also decided not to deliver arms to Ukraine, but we have decided to allow for transit of arms over Austrian territory to Ukraine, which is sort of an obligation we've accepted under the terms of common foreign and security policy, but an obligation that would be contrary to the classical law of neutrality. So this is certainly something that we continue to grapple with. And I personally think, I mean, this is clearly a subject that is still under discussion and very much under discussion in our country, and in a certain sense not even under discussion in our country, because 80% of the population strongly supports neutrality. But the reality is that our membership in the European Union has changed the overall context quite profoundly, and I'm happy to sort of discuss this aspect, because in a certain sense I also believe it is of interest to a public in this country.
Yes, but if you say like Austria is neutral, Switzerland is neutral, with the beginning of the war in Ukraine, Russia full-scale invasion, Sweden, for instance, abandoned their military neutrality, but you had same, as you say, you don't deliver weapons, but they go over your territory. It all sounds like, as you said, I mean, it's not basically neutrality, is it? And if we have the rise in Europe of the political parties, right-wing parties, that are saying, it's not our business, this war, let's like really be neutral, is this indeed possible without consequences?
I mean, the core of military neutrality is that Austria is not a member of a military alliance. And that, for instance, means, as I already said, that we can participate in initiatives on international disarmament in which the members of a military alliance cannot participate, because obviously if you're bound to the nuclear strategy of NATO, you cannot support the kinds of international agreements that Austria has been promoting. So there are some areas where this still plays a certain role. I was only saying in the specific context of war in Europe, of the war of aggression of Russia against Ukraine, where international borders have been violated and where the international order in Europe is at risk. I mean, obviously, Austria cannot say we are neutral between the aggressor and the aggressed, and that we are not, because we've taken sides politically within the European Union. We have not taken a certain number of military steps because we are not part of a military alliance. But obviously, I mean, if you're a member of the European Union, I mean, I can only say, as you know, and as everybody, I mean, in this country knows, a candidate for membership to the European Union is judged inter alia according to the level of its alignment, his alignment with the positions of the European Union. And obviously, where the European Union has taken a position, neither a candidate country nor a member can be non-aligned in the sense of the word. So I think that is an important development.
Yes, of course. Ms. Latinović, we are that a country that wants to become a member of EU, and despite what our government is saying, claiming neutrality in the matter, at the same time condemning Russian invasion and not placing sanctions, are we indeed neutral? Can we call ourselves, Serbia, neutral country in this particular situation of war in Ukraine, where one country attacked the other?
First of all, the neutrality of Serbia is not the same like Austria and Switzerland, because for the neutrality, it's necessary to have two pillars. It's one that you have an internal legal document which define neutrality. And second, that you have an international guarantee for the neutrality. In the case of Austria, it was a state agreement with the guarantor of the neutrality of Austria. In Switzerland, it was a few centuries before, and anyway. But neutrality is a changeable category. In the past, we have many countries which proclaim neutrality, but for different reasons, they left this status. The recent case is a case of Sweden and Finland. This country had different type of neutrality, but defined as a political security model of the foreign policy and security policy for that. Serbia has no this type of neutrality. It's defined with one political document. It's document of resolution of the National Assembly, which limited this neutrality on military neutrality. And it was a result of some special reasons when this resolution was adopted. But in any way, for military neutrality, we have, during the military conflicts, a number of states can proclaim their neutral status, military neutrality, regarding to the one-war conflicts. During the First World War, Italy was neutral until 1917, United States also. In the Second World War, we had a group of states which were neutral in the beginning. Some state, but not. But in any way, regarding to the case of Serbia, it's not compatible to make only this side of neutrality, military neutrality, which is not elaborated with what does it mean. It's not only not to be member of some military blocs, but neutrality as a permanent category needs to have definition of some another obligations.
Yeah, but if we apply one of the criteria that at the beginning was defined by Mr. Greminger, predictability of foreign policy, is Serbia's foreign policy predictable? Can anyone rely on what we're going to...
No, because we have no any document which define what is the strategic document or action plan or something like this. It's from situation to situation. It seems that one day we are more to the east, another day we are more to the west, and the third day we will become from the some of non-aligned states, and our president is speaking in the General Assembly like a leader of some non-aligned states, not as a country which is in advanced period, in advanced status of negotiation with the European Union. It means that we have no one stable position, determination for that. We know that our strategic interest is to obtain this membership status in the European Union, but in the meantime we make some, how to say, collateral activities which are not comparable with the proclaimed strategic aim to be the member of European Union. Only one sentence regarding to neutrality. In the past, neutral and non-aligned countries, Europe, make one excellent example of successful cooperation within the CSE. Namely, non-aligned and neutral states make this informal group, NNG, with Yugoslavia, Malta, and Cyprus, in that time as non-aligned, and Austria, Switzerland, Finland, and Sweden as neutral states. And this group of states find a common approach. It means they'd like to make some, to start the beginning of process to making changing the atmosphere of confrontation in Europe. In that sense, and to make some mediation between East and West, and the results make, which make its military aspects, its including of military aspects in the final document, Helsinki process, and also follow-up of the Helsinki process, which ending with the institutionalization, forming the Organization of Security, etc.
Mr. Greminger, you mentioned that the destiny of small and middle states in this kind of situations is to go with one big, to sit on a fence, to be neutral. Austria, Switzerland, you meet the criteria to do it as your states are. But how about the ones that are hedging, that are sitting on a fence? And we see more and more such countries, and they are by population or their GDP, not small countries at all, countries like India, like Brazil. What is possibly their motivation to sit this one out, so to say?
I'll immediately respond to your question, but I was prompted, by your comment on the N+N, the non-aligned and the neutral countries in the Cold War playing an extremely important role in managing this Cold War, in promoting what was then called the Helsinki process, and kind of building up the CSC and OEC structure. And since we are again in a super polarized situation, it's a bit difficult or dangerous to compare it or even to call it Cold War 2.0. But I mean, there are a lot of features that remind us of the Cold War, and this is why I would argue there is again a space for neutrals, multi-aligned. Again, perhaps we have to reinvent, how we want to call them today. But for those sets of countries that are not ready, to choose any of the sides. Now, why, have you all these fence sitters? Well, the very term fence sitting is very interesting, right? Fence sitting towards what? Perhaps those that we criticize of fence sitting would criticize us for sitting on the fence regarding IHL violations elsewhere, right? Yeah. So I think we need to be careful. There is this entire discussion on double standards, right? That is particularly prominent within the Global South. And I think that illustrates, this concept of fence sitting, or the different perceptions of fence sitting. And I think more countries, in particular in the Global South, they realize that choosing a camp comes at a high price, is not compatible with pursuing their national interests. And I mean, let us just recall the Russian invasion in Ukraine had massive global repercussions on, for instance, food security, energy security. It did destabilize political systems in quite a number of countries. And Well, you know, the political West, and of course, you know, was expecting these countries to kind of side with them, but at the same time, these countries felt pretty much left alone. There was not that much. I mean, it has been changing now over the last 3 years. There has been, I think, more listening to the concerns of the Global South. There has been more support offered, but still, I think there is this sense that, you know, you don't really care about our concerns, but you would want us, you know, to be on your side when it comes to your concerns. So I think that's, I think these perceptions should be taken seriously by all of us. And I think that leads, you know, to a situation where countries then decide on a case-to-case cases with whom they want to partner with whom they want to ally, and I think this is going to be more and more a part of this new polycentric reality.
Can that be a beneficial thing for countries of, for instance, Global South, to be left alone and now to do their own thing and to grow in their own direction without choosing a side in this war of ours, so to say? That is not really ours, yeah.
Well, frankly, I mean, I started out by explaining the very specific situation of a small or medium-sized country that is a member of the European Union.
Yeah.
And there, of course, we are tied by certain obligations, and even there, we have a certain margin in certain areas where we can do useful things. And by the way, at the time when I had the honor of representing Austria on the United Nations Security Council in 2009 and 2010, we did a number of things on the rule of law, on the defense of human rights, that would perhaps have been more difficult for a member state of the European Union that is not member of a military alliance. I simply said that in such a fundamental conflict as the one we are facing right now, a member state of the European Union cannot sit on the fence with regard to policies of the European Union. I think that was my starting point. When it comes to the world at large, I think it is essential that we have countries, and I, again, like Thomas Greminger, I wouldn't call it sitting on the fence. I mean, we have discovered that right now we need countries that can play an important role in re-establishing dialogue between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, it's obvious that at the end, some kind of arrangement will have to be found between the sides, and their countries, like Turkey, for instance, like countries from the Global South, can play and should play an essential role. And in a certain sense, I said this in another discussion today, I mean, what we are seeing here is a challenge to the international order in general, and therefore should also be of concern to countries outside of Europe. And I would strongly encourage countries to take that potential. I think one has to distinguish between the global picture and the specificities of obligations that you have as a member of the European Union.
Okay, but outside of EU, why would these countries care to play such role? I'm not talking Turkey. Turkey is a NATO member, but some India.
As I just said, we discussed this in an earlier discussion today in another part of this very interesting conference. What we are seeing in Europe is a violation of internationally agreed state borders. And I mean, if you reflect on that kind of thing happening on other continents, and the most obvious example is the African continent, where borders on the African continent are in many ways entirely artificial and were accepted as a sort of heritage of the colonial system that nobody wanted to touch, because once you start touching borders, this takes you to a sort of Pandora's box, which will then open. So clearly, in my opinion, there is not only an interest of countries in Europe, but an interest of the global community as such to defend the principle of sanctity of borders. And I mean, if you look at the votes on this subject on the General Assembly, I mean, you see that there's global support for this principle, which goes far beyond the European Union of today, but it would be good for this support to become more operational than it is today.
Yes, of course. Ms. Latinović, we also saw that BRICS is expanding. And we want to say, we often say here in Europe, look, Putin is isolated. Look, almost everybody, even the ones that did not put sanctions, are now members of the European political community. He is isolated, but he's not. He's isolated from our part of the world, on quotation marks. He's not isolated from other very, very big countries. They are joining this organization. Of course, not all of the ones joining are saying bravo for attacking Ukraine. On the contrary. How do you explain this expansion happening, well, last year?
First of all, we still don't know what is the BRICS. BRICS is a very interesting project as a project, and it's one response of Putin regarding to the geopolitical domination of United States and the West. And he liked to take some domination also in this sense, and fight this model, BRICS, which includes the majority of the global south, as it's called, but majority of them are the non-aligned states. We still don't know it is the organization, is the initiative, is a process, or something third. What is the common now is that starting to building multipolar world and the dollarization of the economy. But regarding to the last summit, which held in Russia, we didn't see many results in that sense. First of all, it's not including new member. Instead of that, Russia introduced new terms, new status, partners of BRICS. As I seen, Turkey was among the first who has been offering to follow the BRICS in the status of partner, but nobody knows what does it mean anyway, and is still in the process of developing as a project, as a priority on that. But we have to mind that in the world, according to the data of United Nations, last year it was 40 wars in the world. Majority of them were in the Africa continent. Africa continent is inclining to the BRICS, and now is a very difficult situation regarding to Ethiopia and Egypt for the using of river of Nile, for the construction of plant in that regard. To be the member of some organization which remind on the non-aligned, you have to have moral credibility. It means that you are advocated for the peace, for the disarmament, and for many other things. But multipolarity is interesting, but it's also danger, because in the multipolarity world is different to make a balance. Balance is a key elements for the stability and peace and security in the world. And in that sense, the bloc division, in spite of many bad things, had one good. It's a balance between two superpower regarding to the blocs, and that they had a mutual respect. It means that they not intervene if from one sphere of interest in another of any way. Multipolarity is attractive, but I don't know how it will be realized, because multipolarity in the time when the non-aligned were on the high level was realized through the United Nations, through the General Assembly. General Assembly was a platform where different group of states realized their interests, and they can arise some issue, which resulted to the many resolution in that time, and initiating the process of negotiations of the big project on the human rights, on the protection of climate or any other developing disarmament, and anyway. For the BRICS, it's interesting, but we have also in mind that there are two strong interests and through some rivalry. between Russia and China. We have India and China with not so friendly relations in any way. And for that reason, I think that it's necessary to strengthening multilaterality. First of all, to start very seriously with the reform of the United Nations, because
we'll come to possibly to the reform, because I'm seeing that you would like to react. You were taking notes. Can you share them with us?
I'll say something on the BRICS, but first I want to build on a point that Thomas just made, because I think it's extremely important to make this point very clearly. And I think we have to be very clear that violating borders by military force, respect for international law, for IHL, I think will also need to be constituent features of a multipolar, polycentric world order. And multipolarity cannot be an excuse, for changing borders by military force. And unfortunately, we hear narratives that at least implicitly point in that direction. I think that the point that I tried to make before, I think we just need to be consistent in applying these principles, and not only, ask to apply them to one continent, but also apply to others. I mean, when you ask solidarity respecting Ukraine, of course, but then you should also apply the same principles to the Middle East or to African contexts. The BRICS, I think that's an excellent illustration, expression of this transforming world order, still being very chaotic, unstructured, not having many positive order-shaping forces. I mean, I think the common denominator is to be an alternative to a Western-dominated G7. But beyond that, there is a lot of heterogeneity in the BRICS. You have clearly an anti-Western interest by Russia and China. This is obvious. But you also have others like India and Brazil that clearly would not share this anti-Western interest. I think they're truly multi-aligned, right? And I think their interest is much more to create alternatives also in terms of an economic world order that is an alternative to the Bretton Woods institutions that are so hard to be reformed. And again, I think this needs to be taken seriously. But for the time being, the BRICS is clearly a club driven by very different interests that has hardly a common value base.
Okay. Is there any questions from the audience at this point? No. Well, we'll continue ourselves. Do you believe that projects like BRICS, indeed consisting of countries with very different interests, some are having interests that are colliding, that not necessarily this project, BRICS, but that type of project, combining different countries with different interests and yet finding a common ground on certain issues, that might be the solution for, let's say, new world order?
I mean, I think I wouldn't speak so much of BRICS as a group, but there are clearly within BRICS countries where we would very much hope that they play a stronger role and have a stronger voice on the issues that are of concern to us now. I mean, obviously, within BRICS, you have Russia, which is a party to the conflict, and therefore, I mean, if we're discussing a role in dealing with the conflict right now, obviously we have to think in particular of countries like Brazil, we have to think of countries like South Africa, and there I do think it would be important that they play a more active role. I mean, BRICS has many motivations Nations BRICS has economic interests and other interests as well. But here, I mean, if we're speaking, I mean, of the context alignment, non-alignment, resolving conflicts, there are countries there in the global south which have to play a very important role. And I think that people are arguing, you said at one point that you wanted to get to the subject of the reform of the United Nations, and people are arguing that the Security Council, as it is composed since 1945, represents the world of 1945 and not the world of 2024. But if you say that Africa, that Latin America, that Asia should be more stronger represented in the Security Council, then the corollary of this argument, of course, is that these countries and these regions also have to play a more leading role in the defense of international peace and security. It underlines the legitimacy of this request. And I do have to say, in these conflicts that we're facing right now, it would be important for the world at large to have these regions play a more active role, and that in a certain sense would justify their legitimate demand to have a stronger presence on the Security Council of the United Nations.
But what you hear very often in the General Assembly of United Nations by the small countries from these vast continents, for instance Africa, is that whatever they're saying, nobody is listening, and they mind that. And then they are also remembering their colonial grievances and horrible things done. And then they're saying, we are against the West because West did this to us. This is why we cannot dig ourselves out of this.
Well, I can only say, if I look at the resolutions on the subject we've been discussing here the whole day, I mean, you have more than 140 out of 193 members of the United Nations who have condemned what has happened in this context. But it is true that if you go through the list, some of the most populous countries in the world, I mean, to use your term, give the impression sometimes that they're still sitting on the fence, if I may say so. And there, I mean, I have to say, precisely as these countries, these most populous countries, are claiming the right to have a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, I think it's a legitimate demand. I mean, it's India these days is the most populous country in the world already. But obviously, I mean, in that sense, it is also extremely important that India then plays that sort of role that we all hope it plays and will play.
Yeah. Please.
Yeah, I think the pressure is rising clearly, and if you look at the Pact for the Future that has just been approved by the UN, there is a certain opening. I mean, we all know it. Reforming the UN Security Council is extremely complex, and but I think there is a growing acknowledgement that this needs to be done. And I think what we've been seeing over the last 5-8 years is this explosion of minilateral structures is a response, implicit and explicit, to the resistance to reform by inclusive multilateral bodies like the UN, but we also see it in regional organizations. Now, I'm not blaming the bodies themselves. It's member states that define these bodies' policies, and in particular when it comes to UN Security Council reform. Well, I mean, the first obstacle is the P5 themselves. They are hardly ready to lose their privileges. And then, you know, once you have overcome that obstacle, then the next question becomes who represents continents that are for the time being not represented, you know, for instance, Africa. So it's complicated, but I think the pressure is rising, and I think the same is true for also Bretton Woods institutions. And if we don't manage to kind of reform these inclusive multilateral bodies, we will see even more clubs popping up, you know, that then somehow are interest-driven, by very particular interests, and have hardly common value bases. And I think that's not my vision of the future of multilateralism.
Okay. Ms. Latinović, you wanted to add something?
I was working all my professional period in a multilateral organization, and I'm very much devoted to it. This because multilateral organization reflect the willingness and capabilities of all the states which are in the process, and multilateralism also opened the way for the small country to be active on the international scene. But you have to have the project, and you have to have attractivity for this, and also to respond to the needs, which is the actual. For example, United Nations, it means conference in Geneva on disarmament, which is blocked more than 2 decades, cannot be in position to make some proposal for the international project on disarmament, like anti-personnel mine or cluster munition. But these conventions were adopted thanks to the core group, in which were the Austria, Switzerland, Ireland, and some other small countries, including the countries out of Europe. It means you have to have the project, to have good idea, and to know to elaborate. But regarding to the reform of the United Nations, it's on the agenda for many years, for decades. And it's concentrated on the reform of the Security Council, but only on one aspect, how to make more representative regarding to the other continents. It means to the Europe and the newly power states, middle power states in that sense. But it's blocked. It's blocked by the states which have a right of veto. And their agreement that Security Council need to be more bigger, with the including of the region from Europe, Africa, Asia, Latin America, but without the right of the veto. It means the newly permanent members of Security Council will not be equal like the 5 which now have. But what is the problem with the veto? Veto start to be abused. And to paralyze,
as we are clearly seeing,
yes, to paralyze
since
the decision, more important decision regarding to the question which are related to international peace and security. And we are witnesses of these abuses regarding to the many international conflicts, like it was in it's not international, but with the international reflection in the Syria. Now we see what has happened in regarding to the Ukraine, to Gaza, and anyway. But the consensus is not only the abuses in the Security Council. We have the same cases in the Organization of Security and Cooperation. Recently, I have read it, one statement of actual chairmanship is Foreign Ministry of Malta. He visited Sarajevo and said that everything is in question in OSCE because there are no consensus blocked by Russia regarding to the budget, which is the old story. Every year we have this story, and also for the nomination of the new person on the key the structure institutions within OSCE, Secretary General, Director of Order, at few one. Consensus is a democratic value. It's a result of the democratization of international relations, and in the case of OSCE, the big superpower in that case, the 4 of the members of Security Council are in the CSE or OSCE process. In that time, Soviet Union, it means Russia, USA, France, and United Kingdom have this right of veto in Security Council, but they did not use them in the OCSC, it means that consensus is a method of the adoption of the decision, but it also abuses like a right of veto in Security Council, and we have the results that the international organizations are not productive, not effective, they are paralyzed in any way, but it's everything to the sense as a main aspect is the lack of political will. If you have no political will, which you now have interest to solve so many problems in that, we use some instruments like right of veto or anyway, and to paralyze the process as a whole.
You want to say that UN was constructed for a better world that we have?
Better world,
basically.
we need to have, first of all, and another profile of the politicians. I'm afraid that with the actual trends, with the populist movement, with the authoritarian system of power, which is more present, it's in the higher in the world, not only in the Europe anyway, that we are not be it will be very difficult to reach the agreement regarding to the renewal, the role and the effectiveness, first of all, of the United Nations. No a new international organization could substitute the United Nations and system as a whole.
Yeah.
Well, as a former Secretary General of the OSCE, I have to add something.
Yeah.
I mean, it's true. There is, unfortunately, a lack of a political will. There is a lack of political commitment to provide this organization with a budget and with the leadership. There is currently no Secretary General. Also, other top leadership figures are missing because there is no consensus to appoint them. It's unfortunately more complicated. Of course, Russia's invasion has further polarized the organization, but there is also a massive lack of interest in Western capitals for the proper functioning of this organization. And I think even though, right now this organization seems to be particularly useful for those countries that host field missions, like for instance Serbia, for others it's politically not as relevant. But I would argue we may need the organization again tomorrow, for instance, to monitor a ceasefire, or after tomorrow to again discuss on an inclusive platform how to restore European security. So, my call would be, let's preserve this multilateral body. It could again turn to be very, very useful. But this, would really imply that there is a renewed interest by ministers of foreign affairs, by capitals. This is for the time being lacking, and without that you will not resolve these institutional issues.
Thank you very much for participating in this panel. Well, soon enough, I hope we'll see what kind of a world it will be. Thank you very much.
Thank you.